The silence was the first warning. It was the morning of September 17th, 1629. A small wooden rescue boat was cutting through the crystal-clear waters of the Indian Ocean, heading toward a tiny white strip of sand known as Beacon Island. The men in the boat were rowing hard. Their muscles ached, but their hearts were full of hope. They were rescuers. They believed they were arriving to save nearly 200 women, children, and sailors who had been shipwrecked for months. They expected to find starving, desperate people crawling on the sand, begging for water. They expected tears of joy. But as the boat drifted closer to the shore, the air felt heavy. Wrong. There were no signal fires, no cheering crowds waving for help. Just a terrifying, unnatural stillness. Suddenly, that silence was ripped apart. A single man burst from the dense jungle, sprinting into the surf like a madman. He wasn't running toward them to be saved. He was running as if the devil himself was snapping at his heels. He splashed into the shallow water, his eyes wide with terror that no human should ever have to witness. He screamed, his voice cracking under the weight of pure fear. "Go back. For the love of God, go back. He is going to kill you all." The rescuers froze, their oars hovering over the water. Before they could even process the warning, the nightmare stepped out of the shadows. 4 men emerged from the bushes, and the sight of them broke the rescuers' minds. On this desolate, waterless rock where people should have been dying of thirst, these men were not wearing rags. They were draped in crimson and gold, wearing heavy, expensive royal silk robes meant for kings, shimmering bizarrely against the bleak landscape. They didn't look like survivors. They looked like the lords of a slaughterhouse. They moved with a chilling, practiced calm. They waded into water, tackled the screaming man, and right there, in plain view of the rescue boat, they pulled out knives. With zero hesitation, they slit his throat. The water turned red instantly. The killers didn't run. They didn't hide. They just stood there, wiping the blood from their blades, and smiled at the boat. This wasn't a rescue mission anymore. It was a crime scene. The rescuers realized too late that they hadn't found a group of survivors. They had stumbled upon a kingdom of madness. But to understand how civilized human beings descended into this level of evil, to understand how a simple shipwreck turned into the bloodiest mutiny in history, we have to rewind. We have to go back 3 months to the night the world ended. It was June 4th, the dead of night. The Batavia, the most magnificent ship of the Dutch East India Company, was sailing under a canopy of stars. It was a floating city, carrying chests of silver coins, jewels, and over 300 passengers sleeping soundly in their bunks. The captain believed they were safe. He believed the ocean was their friend. He was wrong. At exactly 2 hours past midnight, the ship's luck ran out. The sound was like a cannon blast, a sickening crunch of timber shattering against stone. The Batavia had slammed into the morning reef at full speed. In seconds, the dream turned into a nightmare. The ship groaned and tilted violently, throwing sleeping passengers across their cabins. Lanterns smashed, starting small fires that hissed out as the freezing ocean poured in. The lower decks flooded instantly. The screams of the drowning mixed with the roar of the waves. Chaos reigned supreme. People were trampled in the dark, fighting for the stairs, fighting for air. The mighty ship was being chewed apart by the teeth of the reef. By the time the sun rose, the Batavia was a broken skeleton. But for the 200 people who managed to swim to the nearby islands, the horror had just begun. They dragged themselves onto the dry land, coughing up salt water, shivering, traumatized. They hugged their children and thanked God they were alive. But they didn't know the truth yet. They had landed on a grave. There was no fresh water here, no food, no shelter, and worse, their leader was about to abandon them. In a desperate bid for survival, the ship's commander, a man named Pelsert, took the only longboat and the best sailors. He told the survivors he was going to find water on the mainland. He promised a return. But as the survivors watched the boat disappear over the horizon, a cold realization settled in their stomachs. They were alone. 200 terrified people trapped on a desert island with no law, and crates of alcohol washing ashore. Panic began to set in, but in the shadows of the crowd, one man was watching Commander leave. He wasn't crying. He wasn't praying. His name was Jeronimus Cornelisz. He was a disgraced pharmacist, a man with a dark past and a twisted philosophy that said sin did not exist. While others saw a tragedy, Jeronimus saw a blank canvas. He looked around at the crying women, the weak men, and the vast wealth scattered on the beach. He realized that with the commander gone, the rules of society were gone too. Slowly, a smile spread across his face. It wasn't a smile of hope. It was a smile of a wolf who had just been left alone in a cage full of sheep. The real horror was just beginning. The sun was no longer their friend. It was an executioner. Days turned into weeks, and the heat on Beacon Island became a physical weight that crushed the survivors into sand. Lips cracked, tongues swelled, and the hallucinations began. 200 people were crowded onto a piece of coral no bigger than a football field, and they were dying of thirst. But while the others were praying for rain, Jeronimus Cornelisz was planning a kingdom. He knew something the others didn't. Before the ship crashed, he had been planning a mutiny. He had planned to seize a ship and become a pirate. If the captain returned with a rescue ship, Jeronimus wouldn't be saved. He would be arrested. He would be hanged. The logic in his mind was cold and terrifyingly simple. For him to live, the witnesses had to die, but he couldn't kill 200 people by himself. He needed disciples. He didn't use a sword. He used a weapon far more dangerous. His voice. Jeronimus began to move through the camp like a ghost, whispering to the younger, weaker men. He targeted the ones who were broken by fear. He sat with them in the dark, offered them a sip of wine from the salvage crates, and poured poison into their ears. He told them that the resources were running out because others were stealing them. He told them that survival was not a right. It was a privilege for the strong. Slowly, methodically, he stripped away their morality. He convinced them that the laws of God and man had drowned with the ship. He wasn't just building a gang. He was building a cult, and in his eyes, he was a messiah. But there was an obstacle, a wall standing between Jeronimus and total control. A group of loyal soldiers led by a man named Wiebbe Hayes. Hayes was everything Jeronimus was not. He was strong, he was moral, and the survivors looked up to him. Jeronimus knew that if he started killing people, Wiebbe Hayes would stop him. So the devil came up with a trick, a lie so smooth that even the smart soldier fell for it. Jeronimus called Hayes to his tent. He looked concerned. He pointed to a long, flat island visible in the distance, miles away across the dangerous open water. He told Hayes that he had seen fresh water there. He told him that if Hayes took his soldiers and swam to that island, they could find water and save everyone. It was a suicide mission, and Jeronimus knew it. There was no water on that distant island. It was a barren rock. He was sending the only men who could stop him to die of thirst in the middle of nowhere. But Hayes, a man of honor, believed him. He gathered his soldiers. They left their weapons behind because they needed to swim. They looked at the women and children one last time, promising to bring back water. Jeronimus stood on the beach, waving goodbye with a sad look on his face, watching his protectors swam away into the deep blue ocean. He waited until they were just tiny specks on the horizon. He waited until he was sure they were gone forever. And then The mask dropped. The moment the soldiers were out of sight, the atmosphere on Beacon Island shifted. It became dark, suffocating. Jeronimus turned to his new followers, the young men he had brainwashed. He gave a silent nod. They moved instantly. They seized every musket, every sword, and every knife from the supply pile. They took control of the food. They took control of the wine. Jeronimus walked to the center of the camp. The survivors looked at him, confused, terrified. They saw the weapons in the hands of his men. They saw the cold, dead look in Jeronimus's eyes. He didn't have to shout. He spoke softly, but his words cut deeper than any blade. He told them that the old world was dead. He told them that the rules they grew up with did not apply here anymore. The island was now his property, and their lives were now in his hands. The soldiers were gone. The captain was gone. God was gone. The survivors realized with a sinking heart that they were no longer castaways waiting for rescue. They were prisoners in a concentration camp, run by a psychopath. And tonight, the purging would begin. The sun went down, but the nightmare did not sleep. Beacon Island had transformed from a shipwreck camp into a theater of hell by the flickering light of campfires. A scene played out that defied all reason. Jeronimus Cornelisz, the failed pharmacist, sat on a makeshift throne built from salvaged treasure chests. He was draped in the captain's scarlet uniforms and layers of royal silk, sipping wine from crystal goblets, looking like a demon king. Surrounding him were his followers, young men dressed in flamboyant clothes, armed with swords and muskets. And below them, crawling in the sand, were the rest of the survivors, naked, starving, trembling with a cold that went deeper than their bones. They dared not look up. They knew that eye contact could mean death. The killing began that night, but it wasn't done for survival. It wasn't done to save food. It was done for sport. Jeronimus treated murder like a game. He would sit back, smile, and point a finger. He didn't want to get his own hands dirty, so he invented sick tests of loyalty. He would force a husband to strangle his own wife, promising that if he did it, he would be allowed to live. He would force a mother to choose which child would survive the night. He broke their minds before he broke their bodies. The air was filled with screams that no one answered. The ocean waves, usually white with foam, began to wash up red. Over the next few weeks, the island became a graveyard. One by one, the weak, the sick, and the unwilling were purged. Bodies were dragged to the water's edge and dumped into the sea like garbage. Sharks began to circle the island, drawn by the constant flow of blood. The count was staggering. 110 people, men, women, and children, slaughtered by the command of one smiling psychopath. Jeronimus believed he had created the perfect kingdom. He had eliminated the weak. He had plenty of food for his chosen few. And most importantly, he believed the only threat to his power, the soldiers led by Wiebbe Hayes, were dead. He had sent them to a dry rock to die of thirst weeks ago. He laughed when he thought about them, imagining their skeletons drying in the sun. But Jeronimus made one fatal mistake. He underestimated the will to survive. Miles away, across the treacherous open water on the high limestone islands, there were no skeletons. There was no death. Wiebbe Hayes and his soldiers were not dead. Against all odds, they had found the impossible. Hidden deep within the rocks of that barren island was a natural spring, fresh, clean water, and not just water. The island was teeming with wallabies and birds. The soldiers were not starving. They were eating meat. They were drinking their fill. They were growing stronger every single day. They had no idea about the massacre happening across the water. They were lighting signal fires, thinking their friends on Beacon Island were safe, waiting for Pelser to return. But the truth arrived on a raft. One afternoon, the soldiers spotted a small, jagged shape bobbing on the waves. It was a makeshift raft, held together by desperation. A man collapsed onto the shore, his body covered in cuts, his eyes hollow. It was a survivor who had managed to escape Jeronimus's camp. Hayes ran to him, offering him water, asking him what happened. The man looked up, gripping Hayes's arm with a strength born of terror. He whispered the words that turned the soldiers' blood to ice. "Everyone is dead," he gasped. "Jeronimus has killed them all. He is the king now, and he knows you are alive. He is coming for you next." Hayes stood up, looking out across the ocean toward the smoke rising from Beacon Island. The shock in his eyes slowly turned into a cold, hard rage. He realized then that they were no longer castaways waiting to be saved. They were an army, the only thing standing between a psychopath and total evil. Hayes looked at his men, who had no guns, no swords, only their bare hands and the rocks on ground. He didn't flinch. He simply said, "Let him come." The war was about to begin. The wind howling over the limestone cliffs carried the scent of salt and the promise of war. On the high island, the 40 soldiers led by Wiebbe Hayes were no longer just shipwreck survivors. They had become something else, something harder. When the escaped survivor told them the truth, that their friends, wives, and children had been slaughtered like cattle across the water, something broke inside them. But it didn't break them into pieces. It forged them into steel. They knew Jeronimus Cornelisz was coming. They knew he had muskets, swords, and a bloodthirsty crew. And they knew they had nothing. No guns, no gunpowder, no armor, just the clothes on their backs and the rage in their hearts. But Wiebbe Hayes looked at his men, gaunt, sunburned, but fierce, and he told them that stone breaks steel. The preparation was frantic, a race against the devil himself. They didn't have a fortress, so they built one using the heavy razor-sharp slabs of limestone and coral that littered the island. They constructed a waist-high wall along the shoreline. It wasn't pretty, but it was solid. It was their Thermopylae. Without weapons, they turned the island itself into an arsenal. They scavenged driftwood from the beach, hammering rusty nails from shipwreck debris into the ends of heavy clubs. They sharpened sticks into crude pikes. They piled heavy rocks, deadly projectiles, behind their wall. They trained in the mud, learning to move as one unit, listening to Hayes's commands. They were ghosts, ragged, bearded, and silent, waiting for the kings in silk to arrive. And then the day came. On the horizon, 2 small boats appeared, cutting through the choppy waves. Jeronimus Cornelisz sat in the lead boat. He was dressed in his finest stolen velvet, laughing with his men, drinking wine. He wasn't coming for a fight. He was coming for an execution. In his mind, the soldiers on this island were already dead. They were supposed to be skeletal, weak from thirst, crawling on their bellies begging for mercy. Jeronimus expected to walk onto the beach, shoot the few who were still moving, and claim the island. His arrogance was his blindfold. As the boats crunched onto the gravel, the mutineers jumped out. They were loud, sloppy, drunk on power. They waved their muskets in the air, jeering at the empty beach. "Come out, rats," they screamed. "Come out and die." But there was no answer, just the wind whistling through the rocks. Confused, they moved forward, walking right into the kill zone. Suddenly, a roar erupted from the earth. "Now!" Hayes screamed. From behind the limestone walls, the ghosts rose up. Before the mutineers could even lift their muskets, a rain of heavy rocks crashed down on them. Bones snapped, skulls cracked. The discipline of the soldiers was terrifying. They didn't charge blindly, they worked in teams. As the mutineers panicked and fired their guns wildly into the air, the soldiers closed the distance. The battle that followed was brutal, primal and chaotic. It was the rage of the righteous against the arrogance of the wicked. A mutineer in a silk robe tried to reload his musket, but before he could pour the powder, a soldier with a spiked club struck him down. Swords clashed against driftwood pikes. The fancy clothes of the killers became heavy and useless in the sand, while the soldiers, light and fast, moved like shadows. Jeronimus watched in horror from the rear. His invincible army was being dismantled. His men were screaming, bleeding, retreating back to the water. The weak, starving skeletons he expected were fighting like demons. The mutineers broke. They scrambled back to their boats, dragging their wounded, pushing off into the safety of the deep water. The soldiers stood on the blood-stained beach, breathing hard, their improvised weapons dripping. They had won the first round, but they knew it wasn't over. Jeronimus was humiliated, and a humiliated narcissist is the most dangerous animal on earth. Days passed. The standoff continued. Jeronimus tried again and again. He sent waves of attackers. He tried to bribe the soldiers, shouting promises of gold and jewels from his boat. The soldiers answered with rocks. He realized he was losing the ground war. He couldn't beat them with force. So, he decided to use his oldest weapon, deception. One morning, Jeronimus walked onto the beach alone. No weapons, no guards. He held his hands up in surrender. He called out to Wiebbe Hayes, his voice dripping with fake sincerity. He proposed a truce, a peace treaty. He said, "Enough blood has been spilled. Let us trade goods, let us talk." Hayes was suspicious, but he agreed to listen. He walked down the water's edge, his eyes locked on the psychopath. It was a tense moment. Two leaders, one built on honor, one built on lies, staring each other down. But as they spoke, a sound cut through the air, a sound that stopped the hearts of every man on that beach. It wasn't a gunshot. It wasn't a scream. It was a sail snapping in the wind. Both men turned their heads toward the open ocean, and there, breaking through the morning mist, was a shape they had not seen in months. A ship, a massive rescue ship, the Sardam. The captain had returned. Time seemed to freeze. For the soldiers, it was salvation. For Jeronimus, it was a death sentence. If the captain reached the soldiers first, he would learn the truth about the massacre. He would know Jeronimus was a monster. Jeronimus's eyes went wide. The truce was over instantly. The mask fell off. He didn't care about peace anymore. He had to stop that ship from hearing the truth, or he had to kill everyone before the ship dropped anchor. The race for the truth had just begun. The white sail on the horizon was not just a piece of cloth. It was a pendulum of fate swinging back. The rescue ship Sardam, commanded by the original Captain Pelsert, was cutting through the morning mist. For months, the survivors had prayed for this moment. But for Jeronimus Cornelisz, this was not salvation. It was the end of the world. He stood on the beach, his velvet robes fluttering in the wind, and his mind raced faster than it ever had before. He knew the captain would ask questions. He knew the soldiers on a high island would tell the truth about the massacre, the rape, and the madness. There was only one way out. He had to capture that ship. Jeronimus turned to his men, the killers who had slaughtered over 100 innocent people. He didn't show fear. He showed calculation. He ordered them to the boats. His plan was audacious, terrifyingly simple. They would row out to the rescue ship, pretending to be relieved survivors. Once they were on board, they would pull their hidden knives, slit the throats of the rescue crew, and seize the ship. Then they would become pirates of the Indian Ocean, disappearing forever. They threw their muskets into the bottom of the boat, covered them with cloth, and began to row. They rowed with the desperate strength of men running from the hangman's noose. But on the other island, Wiebbe Hayes was watching. He saw the mutineers' boat launch. He saw them heading for the rescue ship, and he realized instantly what the devil was planning. If Jeronimus reached that ship first, the captain would be dead, and the truth would die with him. Hayes didn't hesitate. He looked at his soldiers, men who had fought with sticks and stones, and he gave the order, launch the boat. It was a race against time, a race for justice. The two small boats cut across the blue water, converging on the unsuspecting rescue ship, Jeronimus and his men in their stolen silks, versus Hayes and his soldiers in their ragged clothes. The distance was closing. The captain on the deck of the Sardam looked through his telescope, confused. He saw men in bright red uniforms rowing toward him. He thought they were his crew, safe and sound. He smiled, preparing to welcome them. He had no idea he was waving at his own assassins. But then, a sound tore across the water. It was the voice of Wiebbe Hayes. He was standing up his small boat, waving his arms frantically, screaming until his throat bled. Mutiny! Do not let them board. They are murderers. The wind carried his voice. Faint but clear, the captain froze. He lowered his telescope. He looked at the men in the silk robes, and for the first time, he saw the glint of steel hidden beneath their clothes. The smile vanished from his face. Jeronimus saw that the jig was up. He screamed at his men to row faster, to board the ship before the cannons could be loaded. But they were too late. The captain shouted a command that echoed like thunder. Run out the guns. The wooden ports of the rescue ship flew open and the black, iron mouths of the cannons pointed directly at Jeronimus's tiny boat. Stop, or we blow you to hell. The captain's voice boomed over the water. The silence that followed was heavy. Jeronimus Cornelisz, the man who had played God, the man who had decided who lived and who died, looked up at the massive ship towering over him. He looked at the cannons, and in that moment, the king of Beacon Island shrank back into what he really was. A coward. A failed pharmacist with a silver tongue. Slowly, trembling, he raised his hands in surrender. The soldiers on Hayes' boat cheered, a raw, guttural sound of victory. The reign of terror was finally over. But justice had to be served. And in the 17th century, justice was not gentle. The captain took control of the islands. He saw the mass graves. He saw the skeletons. He heard the sobbing testimonies of the women who had been kept as slaves. He looked at the 110 empty spaces where men, women, and children used to be. His rage was cold and absolute. He didn't take Jeronimus back to civilization for a trial. He decided that the monster would be judged right there. On the very sand he had stained with blood, a trial was held. Jeronimus tried to talk his way out of it, blaming his men, blaming the heat, blaming the devil. But the captain wasn't listening. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was death. But before he could die, he had to pay the price for the hands he had used to command the slaughter. On October 2nd, 1629, a gallows was built on the coral reef. The entire surviving group stood watching. There was no pity in their eyes. Before the noose was placed around his neck, the executioner stepped forward with a heavy blade. Following the ancient laws of the sea, Jeronimus's hands, the hands that had signed the death warrants of so many, were chopped off. He screamed, a sound of pure agony that finally matched the pain he had inflicted on others. And then the trapdoor opened, the rope snapped tight, the whispering devil swung in the wind. Silence forever. The survivors were loaded onto the Sardam. As the ship pulled away, they looked back at Beacon Island one last time. It looked peaceful now, just a white strip of sand in a beautiful blue ocean. But they knew the truth. They knew that the island wasn't the monster. The monster had been among them the whole time. Today, nearly 400 years later, if you visit the Abrojos Islands, you can still find the bones, shallow graves in the coral. Telling the story of the Batavia, it serves as a grim reminder to the world. We like to think that civilization protects us, that we are better than animals. But this story, the story of the smiling skulls, proves that the line between man and monster is thinner than we think. All it takes is a little bit of power, a little bit of desperation, and the right voice whispering in the dark. The ship sank, the people died, but the question remains. If you were on that island, starving, terrified, and alone, would you have been the soldier, or would you have joined the cult?